Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. In Mark chapter 10, we have a curious exchange between Jesus and two of his disciples. James and John make a request to sit at the right and left of Jesus in his glory. And Jesus responds rather cryptically by talking about drinking from his cup and being baptized with his baptism. And then after this, Jesus addresses all of his disciples with talk of giving up his life as a ransom for many. What we're going to do is take a look at the Old Testament background, especially of what it means to drink from the cup of the Lord, which is by and large a negative image. And then we're going to see how Isaiah 53 plugs into what Jesus says when he talks about giving his life as a ransom for many. So we got some great material to get to. Let's begin with this opening dialogue between Jesus and the two brothers. This is from Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 37. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." Now we'll see in this particular example that the tendency of human nature, anytime there's talk about the cross and suffering of Christ, to gravitate toward the road of glory and self-exaltation. We see this over and over in the Gospels, how when Jesus talks about his impending crucifixion, when he talks about all the suffering that he's going to endure, his disciples react by doing the exact opposite of what he's talking about. If he talks about suffering, they want to talk about glory. If he talks about servanthood, they want to talk about self-exaltation. So we see that talk of crucifixion, suffering, death, all of this triggers within the hearts of sinners the opposite reaction. Anytime there's talk of suffering, there is this gravitational pull towards glory and self-exaltation. Now, if you look at the context in Mark chapter 10, we'll see that the same thing is happening here. So the disciples make this request to sit at these glorious places of honor. What precedes this? Well, what precedes this is Jesus' explicit, graphic description of his own suffering that's to take place in Jerusalem. So take a look at the verses leading up to this request of James and John. This is Mark 10, 32 and 33. Taking the 12 again, Jesus began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." Jesus says this, and how do James and John react? They react by asking for these places of honor and glory with Jesus in his kingdom. It's as if they don't understand what Jesus is saying or reject what he's saying, or what Jesus says tends to have this reaction with them, which makes them want glory instead of the cross. And this is not the first time this has happened. So if you look back in Mark's gospel to chapter 8 and chapter 9, the same things happen. So in chapter 8, verse 31, Jesus will suffer, be rejected, killed, and rise after 3 days. And how does Peter react? By rebuking Jesus. He says, "No, this is not the way it's going to be." Jesus responds to the rebuke of Peter by talking to his disciples about denying themselves and taking up their crosses and following him. So Jesus responds to Peter's response by once more directing his disciples to taking up the cross, to being servants, to denying themselves. And then skip forward one chapter to Mark chapter 9. Again, Jesus says he'll be delivered, killed, rise after 3 days. His disciples don't understand what he's talking about, and they're afraid to ask him. Jesus responds to this by once more directing his disciples to something which is lower. So he says, "Become like little children, and then you will be as those who will enter into the kingdom." Now, we get to chapter 10, same sequence of events. Jesus makes this extremely explicit prophecy about what's to happen to him in Jerusalem. James and John make the request. Jesus responds to them as well as the rest of the disciples by talking about becoming servants, becoming last, and that he came not to serve, but to be served and to give his life as a ransom for many. So what we see in Mark chapter 10 is the pattern from Mark 8 and Mark 9, as well as the pattern that's still followed by people today. The cross tends to be rejected for the other choice of glory. So this particular text is indicative of the propensity of human nature to embrace what is sometimes called a theology of glory rather than a theology of the cross. But let's look at how Jesus responds to the disciples. This is instructive for us as well. So Mark 10:38 through 40. Jesus says to them, to the brothers, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Now notice what Jesus says. He first asked the question, can you drink this? Can you be baptized? And they say, "We are able." And then he says, "You will." Now what's he talking about? What cup will they drink from? What baptism will they endure? Well, we have two different kinds of images here, right? We have the baptism image, we have the cup image. There's a whole lot of Old Testament material about what it means to drink the cup. So let's look at that first, and then we'll touch on the baptism part. So if we go back to the Old Testament, look at the Hebrew, the word for cup is kos. And most of the time, this might surprise you, maybe not, but most of the time, when you have talk of the cup of the Lord in the Old Testament or drinking from the Lord's cup, this is not something you want to do. This is drinking the cup of judgment. It's drinking the cup often of anger or derision or shame. So most of the time, when the Lord has a cup in his hand, you don't want to drink from it, because what you're going to drink is going to be some form of suffering or punishment. And let's look at some examples of this. And these are not all the examples. There's a whole lot of others that we could have added here, but these are just representative. So a couple from the Psalms. Psalm 11 says that the portion that's in the Lord's cup that he's going to give his enemies to drink is fire and sulfur and a scorching wind, not the kind of stuff you want to drink. Psalm 75 says, "In the hand of the Lord there's a cup with foaming wine. It's well mixed, and he pours out of this, and all the wicked of the earth are going to drain it down to its dregs." The cup of the Lord is full of this divine punishment for the enemies. Jump forward to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. You have the same kind of language. Isaiah 51 says to the city of Jerusalem to wake up. It's as if she's got this terrible hangover from what she's been drinking, because what has she been drinking from? The cup in the hand of the Lord that was the cup of his wrath. And Jerusalem has drunk that down to the dregs. Jeremiah 25 is God's talking to the prophet, and he's basically giving him what you might call a cup ministry, because in Jeremiah's hand is placed the cup of the Lord. And what is he to do with this? He's to take this wine of wrath and he's to make all the nations drink from it. Ezekiel 23 is describing two sisters. These sisters are the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And God says, "You've gone the way of your sister, therefore I will give her cup into your hand." And this cup, it says, is deep and large, and you'll be laughed at and held in derision, because what it contains is horror and desolation. So all of these images together present us with the Lord's cup as not something, of course, you want to drink from, because it's full of all sorts of bad stuff. Now, this goes over into the New Testament in a surprising sort of way. A couple of times, we have this in the Gospels, and then we have it again in the book of Revelation. So we'll just take a look at Mark's use of this. Of course, Mark 10:38 is the text we're looking at, drinking from the cup of Jesus' suffering. But Mark 14:36 is probably the one we're more familiar with. This is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night in which he's betrayed and arrested. And he's praying, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but you will." What cup is he talking about? Of course, he's talking about this Old Testament kind of cup. What he's about to drink from is the cup of crucifixion, the cup of suffering, the cup of wrath. He's about to drink down to the dregs, drain all the way to the dregs, every little bit of judgment and wrath, every drop of that is going to fill this chalice. And Jesus on the cross is going to tilt it to his lips and is going to drain it down until there is nothing left whatsoever. That's what's happening in his crucifixion. He's draining the cup of the Lord's judgment against sin, so that when Jesus finishes it off, there is nothing left. Now, jump forward to Revelation, and we have in 14, 9 through 11, this talk of anybody worshiping the beast or its image. They will receive a mark on their forehead or their hand, and he will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger. What this is talking about is for those who refuse to believe that Jesus has drained the cup of the Lord's wrath, they will receive that judgment of rejecting the Messiah, of not believing in that which he has accomplished for them. And so we have this image of the cup of the Lord's wrath picked up from the Old Testament and talked about in Revelation 14. Okay, that's the cup part. What about this baptism part? Well, this is a little bit different. We have a lot of material on the cup of the Lord being drained, or the cup of the Lord being drunk from by the nations. We have all that Old Testament material. Not as much talk about how baptism is a metaphor for suffering, but there is a little bit. So if you look at outside the scriptures, and people like Josephus and Philo, both of whom were first century Jewish writers, as well as a few other authors who wrote in Greek, sometimes the verb for baptize, baptizo, is used to talk about some kind of suffering. So it's used to describe the suffering of shipwreck, to drown, to perish, to bring the city to the brink of destruction, to go under, to sink into sleep. It's sometimes used to describe being overwhelmed by faults or desires or by sicknesses. I got all those examples from the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, where they would talk about this verb baptizo, where it's used in these metaphorical sorts of ways to describe suffering. There is actually one particular instance in the book of Isaiah, chapter 21, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where the verb for baptize is used in a context to describe some sort of suffering. This is from Isaiah 21:4. My heart wonders and transgression overwhelms me. Baptize is the verb that's used there. Transgression baptizes me, as it were. My soul is occupied with fear. Now, this is just one example that we have, and only one example we have in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where baptism is used to connote some sort of overwhelming experience or some sort of suffering connected with this. But most of the time, that is described in terms of drinking from the Lord's cup. So Jesus is perhaps introducing a relatively novel way of describing his suffering in terms of baptism. And then he's picking up the Old Testament language of cup drinking also to describe this. Now, Jesus says to James and John, you will drink of this cup, and you will be baptized with this baptism, meaning you will suffer. You will indeed suffer by drinking this cup and by being baptized with this baptism. James, of course, we know that he suffered as a martyr early in the life of the church. I believe it's Acts chapter 12 is where he suffers martyrdom. John, according to tradition, was the one disciple who was not martyred. He lived to an old age, but in the course of his life, he did endure suffering for the sake of the name. So when Jesus says, you will drink this cup, you will be baptized, he's saying, yes, you will suffer. You will not suffer as Jesus did, but you will suffer because you are a follower and a witness of Christ. But then notice how he ends this. He says, but to sit at my right or my left, that's not for me to grant. It's for those for whom it's been prepared. Now, I think a couple of things could be going on here. Number one, in Jesus' glory, in his glorious state, who's going to sit in his right and his left? Well, that's for the Father to decide. When it says it's for those for whom it has been prepared, that passive tense of the verb almost always connotes God as the active subject. So what Jesus is saying, it's for those for whom God has prepared that place of honor or glory. It's not for James and John to somehow ask for or earn or anything like that. God has decided who's going to have those places. But it can also mean this. If you look in Mark's gospel, the only other place where there's mention of being on the right and the left of Jesus is, of course, in his crucifixion. On his right and on his left were two criminals. They were the ones for whom this particular place had been prepared when Jesus was crucified. Now, isn't it interesting, too, that John, one of these two brothers, who asked to sit on the right or left of Jesus in his glory, isn't it fitting that that particular disciple, John, who wanted to sit on the right or left in his glory, would be the one evangelist, Gospel of John, the one evangelist who especially talks about how the glory of God is revealed in the crucifixion of Jesus, when there was a criminal to his right and to his left. It seems as if John learned his lesson. He came to realize later on that it was wrong, it was sinfully ambitious of him to ask to sit in the place of honor in Jesus' glorious kingdom. And instead he realized, oh, the glory of God is revealed precisely in the crucifixion of Jesus, when you had a criminal to his right and to his left. Okay, so that's kind of the first section of this particular reading. When the disciples hear about the request of James and John, let's see how they react. Let's pick it up with Mark 10:41 through 45. When the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him, and he said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Okay, the other disciples, when they hear James and John make this request, how do they respond? Well, they're indignant. The Greek for indignant is aganakteo, and it occurs 3 times in Mark's gospel. It occurs, first of all, in Mark chapter 10, earlier in the chapter, verse 14. When Jesus saw it, that is, when Jesus saw his disciples preventing people from bringing little children to him, he was aganakteo. He was upset. He was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me." So Jesus is indignant with his disciples for keeping children away from coming to him for his blessing. And now these same disciples are indignant at James and John because they've made this request. And then one more time, Mark 14, verse 4, some people who saw the woman anoint Jesus with this expensive oil, they were indignant, said, "Why was this ointment wasted like that?" So they were indignant over what they thought was a waste of money. Now, that's the way the disciples respond, but why? Are they upset because James and John did the wrong thing? No, it seems they're upset because they made this request before the other disciples did. So they got ahead of them. They preemptively asked for these seats of honor, whereas the other disciples thought that they themselves should have received these places of honor. And we know this because of the way that Jesus responds to all of them, to all 12 of his disciples. So he says that he uses the same language of reversal that we often have about the last being first and being servant of all, if you want to be greatest of all. And the verb that he uses here to describe serving, he says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. That Greek verb is diakoneo. It's a word from which we get deacon and deaconess. So they are the servants. Now, this serving Son of Man, this Son of Man who came to be served, this needs to be read, in my opinion, this needs to be read in light of the servant of the Lord language in the book of Isaiah, chapter 42 through 53. Now, in the Greek translation in the Septuagint, the Greek verb that's used for this serving or servant is not the same one that we have here in Mark chapter 10. It's not diakoneo. However, it is still the language of service, of being a servant. And we'll see there's other connections between what Jesus says and this section of Isaiah. Now, Jesus says he came not to be served, so he didn't come so that everybody else could serve him. Instead, he came that he might be the servant, that he might serve others. And how's he going to do this? How's he going to be a servant to others? Well, he's going to give his life as a lutron, as a ransom for many. Now, what does it mean to be a ransom? If you look at the commentary on the Gospel of Mark by R.T. France, he's got a really good summary description of what this particular Greek word, lutron, or ransom, means. In secular Greek, so this is Greek not used in these are writings outside the Bible. In secular Greek, lutron was mainly used for a payment to secure release, whether from slavery or from capture. So we use that same language today, right? If you ransom someone who's been kidnapped, for instance. The verb lutrao occurs frequently in the Septuagint for God's redemption of his people, not only from slavery in Egypt, but also from spiritual oppression. And lutron is used for payments to preserve a life, which is legally forfeit, including the firstborn, or subject to divine punishment. So he sums it up by saying the essential meaning is deliverance by the payment of an equivalent. So when you give a lutron, you're pulling someone out of whatever bad situation they're in, whether it's slavery or some other predicament. You're redeeming them. You're ransoming them. So when Jesus says that he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom, give his life as a lutron, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's look at this in the context of Isaiah chapter 52 and 53. This is where you have all this talk about the Messiah giving his life, suffering, be a man of sorrows. He is oppressed. He's stricken. He is smitten. He's afflicted. He offers himself as a sacrifice. Of course, all of that is the vivid crucifixion language of Isaiah chapter 53. Now, there are some verbal echoes between what Jesus says and the language that's used in Isaiah 53. For instance, in Mark 10, Jesus says he is going to give his life. The Greek verb that's used there is dunai, which is from didomi. And then, of course, literally it's to give his soul as a ransom. So to give his life, to give his soul. That same kind of language is used in Isaiah 53:12, where it says his soul, again, same Greek word for soul, both in Mark and in Isaiah. His soul was delivered to death. Now that is a similar word. It's paradidomi. So didomi in Mark 10, paradidomi in Isaiah chapter 53. Both the idea of the soul or the life being given or being given over, being delivered. And then Jesus says he gives his life as a ransom, a lutron. If you look in Isaiah 53:10, it's talking about the Messiah's soul making an offering for guilt. And the Hebrew word that's used there is asham. Asham is a guilt offering. You can read all about that in the book of Leviticus. A guilt offering was offered for someone who had committed some act of sacrilege. And the guilt offering was an offering, and then even more was added to the offering as a way of paying for the guilt of the transgression of what had been committed. So the Messiah becomes this guilt offering. He becomes the sacrifice required to free Israel as well as the rest of the world from this uncleanness, from this sacrilege that they had brought upon themselves. Then Jesus says he gives his life as a ransom for many. And this language of many, both in the Greek and then in its Hebrew equivalent, is used in Isaiah 53:11 and 12 2 or 3 times, where the servant makes many righteous and bears the sins of many. Okay, you put all this together, and what do you have? I think what Jesus is communicating here, based upon the connections between Isaiah 53 and what he says in Mark 10, you can kind of summarize it like this. Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That, in essence, means this. The Son of Man is not the kind of Messiah who exercises heavy-handed authority and lords it over his subjects. Rather, he is the servant Messiah who makes himself last, makes himself slave of all to give his life as a ransom, a guilt offering to redeem and cleanse his polluted people. He is the servant of the Lord whom Isaiah prophesied. So Jesus says to his disciples, including James and John and the rest of them, listen, you've got this wrong image in your head. You want to be a leader? Well, then make yourself a servant. You want to be great? Then make yourself small. You want to be in a place of glory? Then take up your cross and follow me. Drink from my cup. Be baptized with my baptism. In other words, he's trying to turn the minds of his disciples upside down so that they are actually right side up from God's perspective. He wants them to look at things through a cruciform perspective, through a cross perspective, to understand who He is and what His mission is, and then not just that, but how that impacts their own life and ministry. That it's not about doing things for themselves. It's not about some kind of self-exaltation. It's not about some sort of selfish ambition. The life of a disciple of Christ is a life of service and self-sacrifice and putting others first instead of putting number one first. And in so doing, it's about a life that is lived in light of the cross, where we drink from the cup of the Lord, we're baptized with His baptism. In other words, we ourselves suffer for the sake of the name, in order that through our weakness and suffering, God is able to accomplish that which He desires in our lives. And in the end, when we see baptism and the cup now, this gives us an understanding of what exactly the Lord's Supper is and what baptism are. The Lord's Supper and baptism bring us into the crucifixion and suffering of Jesus Christ, so that through that we might pass into resurrection and life. Jesus, by using the language of the Lord's Supper and baptism, is helping us to understand exactly what these two gifts of God are. They're the means by which we are incorporated into the crucifixion of Jesus, so that we might also be part of His resurrection life. Well, that is Mark chapter 10. It's some good Old Testament background, and hopefully it gives you a better perspective on exactly how this gospel fits into the broader biblical story. I pray that you're all doing well, and that God grants you His peace and His mercy as you prepare for this coming Sunday and the celebration of the Lord's Day and meditation upon His Word, which always directs us to Jesus Christ and His cross and His resurrection for us. Peace be with all of you. We'll see you next week.